90-year-old beggar woman is humiliated by a clothing store manager, accused of stealing an old ruby necklace. When the police arrive, everyone is in shock. In the heart of New York City, where skyscrapers touched the clouds and streets bustled with endless activity, 90-year-old Olivia Holloway shuffled along the sidewalk. Her weathered hands clutched a tattered shawl around her frail shoulders, her silver hair peeking out from beneath a faded knit cap. Despite her hunched posture and slow gait, there was a quiet dignity in her pale blue eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of stories. Olivia's daily routine had become a familiar sight to the locals. She'd make her way down Fifth Avenue, pausing occasionally to catch her breath or to watch the world rush by. Some passers-by would toss coins into the small tin can she kept by her side, while others hurried past, averting their eyes from the elderly woman who seemed to blend into the city's background. "Thank you, dear," Olivia would murmur softly to those who showed kindness, her voice barely audible above the city's cacophony. Her gratitude was genuine, each coin a small lifeline in her precarious existence. As the morning sun climbed higher, Olivia found her usual spot near a busy intersection. She settled onto a piece of cardboard, her joints creaking in protest. From this vantage point, she could observe the ebb and flow of city life: businessmen in crisp suits, tourists with their maps and cameras, young couples lost in their own worlds. "Spare some change?" she'd ask gently as people passed, her voice carrying no expectation, just a quiet hope. Most ignored her, their eyes fixed straight ahead or glued to their phones. But Olivia didn't mind. She understood the city's rhythm, its tendency to overlook those who didn't fit into its glossy narrative. As the day wore on, Olivia's thoughts drifted, as they often did, to a time long past. A time when she wasn't invisible, when her life was filled with love, laughter, and the sparkle of precious gems. She absent-mindedly fingered the old ruby necklace hidden beneath her layers of worn clothing, her last connection to that bygone era. "Oh, Charles," she whispered to herself, a small smile playing on her lips as she remembered her late husband's twinkling eyes and gentle touch. "If only you could see me now." The necklace was her most cherished possession, a final gift from Charles before he vanished without a trace decades ago. It was all she had left of her former life, a life that seemed more like a dream with each passing year. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street, Olivia decided it was time to move. Her legs protested as she slowly rose, leaning heavily on a gnarled wooden cane. She began her slow journey back through the city streets, her eyes catching glimpses of the luxury boutiques and high-end department stores that lined the avenue. One store in particular caught her attention. Its window display showcased mannequins draped in elegant evening wear, sparkling with sequins and jewels. Olivia paused, drawn in by the glittering scene. For a moment, she saw a reflection of her younger self in the glass, a woman in a beautiful gown, her neck adorned with the very ruby necklace she now kept hidden. Lost in her reverie, Olivia didn't notice the suspicious glances from the store's security guard or the whispers of nearby shoppers. To them, she was just another homeless person, out of place in this world of luxury and excess. As she turned to continue her journey, Olivia's foot caught on an uneven bit of sidewalk. She stumbled, her cane clattering to the ground. In that moment of imbalance, her shabby coat fell open, revealing a flash of deep red, the ruby necklace catching the late afternoon sun. A collective gasp rose from the small crowd that had gathered. The security guard stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the unexpected glimmer of wealth around the old woman's neck. Olivia, oblivious to the attention she had drawn, simply bent to retrieve her cane, wincing at the effort. As she straightened up, she found herself face to face with the store's manager, a tall man in an impeccable suit whose eyes darted between Olivia's weathered face and the ruby necklace. The air seemed to crackle with tension as two worlds collided on that busy New York sidewalk. Little did Olivia know that this chance encounter was about to shatter the quiet routine of her life, setting in motion a chain of events that would force her to confront her past and challenge everything the city thought it knew about the old woman they had long ignored. The store manager, a man in his mid-40s named Richard Blackwell, stepped closer to Olivia, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized the ruby necklace. The crowd around them grew, curious onlookers drawn by the unusual scene unfolding on the busy sidewalk. "Excuse me, ma'am," Richard said, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Where did you get that necklace?" Olivia blinked, confused by the sudden attention. She clutched her shawl tighter, instinctively covering the necklace. "It's mine," she replied softly, her voice trembling slightly. "It's always been mine." Richard's lips thinned into a tight line. "That's impossible. That necklace looks remarkably similar to a piece that was reported stolen from our store last week." He turned to the security guard. "Call the police." Panic flashed across Olivia's weathered face. "No, please," she pleaded, her pale blue eyes widening with fear. "There must be some mistake. My husband gave me this necklace years ago." A murmur rippled through the growing crowd. Some people shook their heads in disbelief, while others watched with a mix of pity and suspicion. "Your husband?" Richard scoffed, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Ma'am, that necklace is worth more than most people make in a year. How could someone like you possibly own something like that?" Olivia's chin quivered, but she stood her ground. "I'm telling you the truth. My Charles, he was a jeweler. This was the last gift he gave me before—" Her voice trailed off, lost in painful memories. Richard's expression softened for a moment, but he quickly composed himself. "I'm sorry, but I can't just take your word for it. We'll let the police sort this out." As they waited for the authorities to arrive, the crowd continued to grow. Whispers and speculations flew back and forth. Some defended Olivia, arguing that she didn't look like a thief, while others insisted appearances could be deceiving. Among the onlookers was Sarah Chen, a young journalist for a local newspaper. She watched the scene unfold with keen interest, her reporter's instincts telling her there was more to this story than met the eye. Sarah approached Olivia, who was now sitting on a nearby bench, looking small and vulnerable. "Ma'am," Sarah said gently, "I'm Sarah Chen from the New York Daily. Would you mind telling me more about your necklace?" Olivia looked up, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "It's all I have left of him," she whispered, "of my old life." Intrigued, Sarah sat down next to her. "Your old life? What do you mean?" Before Olivia could answer, two police officers arrived on the scene. Officer Rodriguez, a compassionate woman in her 30s, approached Olivia while her partner, Officer Thompson, spoke with Richard. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez said, kneeling to meet Olivia's eyes, "can you tell me what's going on here?" Olivia took a deep breath, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the necklace hidden beneath her clothes. "This necklace is mine," she said, her voice stronger now. "I've had it for over 50 years. It was a gift from my husband, Charles Holloway." At the mention of the name, a hush fell over the crowd. Officer Rodriguez's eyes widened in recognition. "Charles Holloway? The famous jeweler who disappeared in the 70s? Richard stepped forward, his face a mask of disbelief. "That's impossible. Charles Holloway's wife died years ago. Everyone knows that." Olivia shook her head slowly. "No, I didn't die. I just disappeared, like Charles." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. Officer Rodriguez exchanged a glance with her partner. "Ma'am, I think we need to continue this conversation at the station. We'll need to verify your identity and the ownership of the necklace." As Olivia was helped to her feet, Sarah Chen quickly approached Officer Rodriguez. "Excuse me, officer. I'm a reporter with the New York Daily. This story seems significant. Would it be possible for me to follow up on this?" Officer Rodriguez hesitated, then nodded. "Once we've sorted things out, we'll release an official statement. You can contact the precinct for more information." As Olivia was gently led to the police car, the crowd buzzed with excitement and confusion. Richard watched, his earlier certainty now tinged with doubt. Sarah Chen furiously scribbled notes, knowing she might be onto the biggest story of her career. And Olivia, the woman who had been invisible for so long, suddenly found herself at the center of attention. As she settled into the back of the police car, she closed her eyes, memories of a long-buried past rising to the surface. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to think of Charles, of the life they had shared, and of the mysterious circumstances that had led her to this moment. As the police car pulled away from the curb, Olivia knew that her quiet life on the streets of New York was over. Whether for better or worse, her past had finally caught up with her, and the truth she had kept hidden for so long was about to come to light. The police station buzzed with activity as Olivia Holloway was led through its doors. Officers paused in their tasks, curious about the frail, elderly woman who seemed so out of place in their world of law and order. Officer Rodriguez guided Olivia to a small private room, her touch gentle but firm. "Please, have a seat, Mrs. Holloway," Officer Rodriguez said, gesturing to a comfortable chair. "Can I get you some water?" Olivia nodded gratefully, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she accepted the paper cup. "Thank you, dear," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. As Olivia sipped her water, Detective James Harper entered the room. He was a seasoned investigator in his 50s, known for his keen eye and compassionate approach. He sat across from Olivia, his kind eyes studying her face. "Mrs. Holloway," he began, his tone respectful. "I'm Detective Harper. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your necklace and your history. Is that all right?" Olivia nodded, her pale blue eyes meeting the detective's gaze. "Of course, Detective. I have nothing to hide." Detective Harper leaned forward, his expression open and encouraging. "Can you tell me about your husband, Charles Holloway?" A small smile played on Olivia's lips, her eyes misting with memories. "Charles was extraordinary, brilliant, kind, and so passionate about his work. We met when I was just a girl, working as a sales clerk in a department store. He was already making a name for himself as a jeweler." As Olivia spoke, her voice grew stronger, as if sharing her story was breathing new life into her frail form. She told of their whirlwind romance, their marriage, and the early years of their life together, as Charles's reputation in the jewelry world grew. "The necklace," Olivia continued, her hand unconsciously moving to her throat, "was the last piece Charles ever made. He gave it to me on our 20th wedding anniversary, just days before he disappeared." Detective Harper's eyebrows rose. "Can you tell me about the day he disappeared?" Olivia's face clouded, the joy of her earlier memories fading. "It was a Tuesday. Charles had been working late at his studio, as he often did. But that night, he didn't come home. I waited, called his friends, the police, but it was as if he'd vanished into thin air." As Olivia recounted the frantic days and weeks that followed, Detective Harper listened intently, making occasional notes. The investigation had turned up nothing. No body, no ransom demand, no signs of foul play. Charles Holloway had simply ceased to exist. "And you, Mrs. Holloway?" Detective Harper asked gently. "The records show that Olivia Holloway was declared dead in 1990. What happened?" Olivia's eyes dropped to her lap, her voice barely audible. "I couldn't bear it. The pitying looks, the whispers, the constant reminders of Charles. One day, I just walked away, left everything behind. I thought it would be easier to disappear, to become no one." A heavy silence fell over the room as the weight of Olivia's words sank in. Detective Harper exchanged a glance with Officer Rodriguez, who had remained quietly in the corner. "Mrs. Holloway," Detective Harper said softly, "I'm so sorry for what you've been through. We'll need to verify your identity, of course, but I believe you. Now, about the necklace." Before he could continue, there was a knock at the door. Officer Thompson entered, looking slightly flustered. "Detective, there's someone here you need to speak with. A Mr. Edwin Holloway. He says he's Charles Holloway's nephew." Olivia's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. "Edwin? Little Eddie? Moments later, a distinguished man in his 60s entered the room. His eyes, the same shade of blue as Olivia's, widened in shock as he took in the sight of the elderly woman. "Aunt Olivia?" he gasped, his voice choked with emotion. "Is it really you?" Olivia stood shakily, her arms opening wide. "Eddie, my boy, you've grown so much." As Edwin embraced his long-lost aunt, tears streaming down both their faces, Detective Harper and the officers watched in amazed silence. The story of Olivia Holloway was unfolding before their eyes, a tale of love, loss, and unexpected reunions. Outside the police station, a small crowd had gathered, word of the mysterious elderly woman and her valuable necklace spreading quickly. Among them, Sarah Chen stood vigilant, her reporter's notebook in hand, waiting for any scrap of information about the unfolding drama inside. As the sun began to set over New York City, casting long shadows across the bustling streets, the truth about Olivia Holloway and her ruby necklace was slowly coming to light, promising to change the lives of everyone involved in ways they could never have imagined. The reunion between Olivia and Edwin was a poignant scene that touched everyone in the room. As they slowly separated from their embrace, Edwin gently guided his aunt back to her chair, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Detective Harper cleared his throat, his voice soft with respect for the moment. "Mr. Holloway, thank you for coming in. Your presence here certainly adds credibility to Mrs. Holloway's story." Edwin nodded, his eyes never leaving Olivia's face. "I can hardly believe it myself. Aunt Olivia, we had a funeral for you years ago." Olivia's weathered hand reached up to pat Edwin's. "I'm so sorry, dear. I never meant to cause such pain. I just couldn't bear it anymore." Detective Harper leaned forward, his expression gentle but focused. "Mrs. Holloway, Mr. Holloway, I hate to interrupt, but we still need to address the matter of the necklace. Mrs. Holloway, would you be willing to let us examine it?" Olivia hesitated for a moment, then slowly nodded. With trembling hands, she reached beneath her tattered clothing and carefully withdrew the ruby necklace. The deep red stones caught the fluorescent light of the room, sending crimson flashes across the walls. Edwin gasped. "The Holloway ruby," he whispered in awe. "I remember Uncle Charles working on this. It was his masterpiece." Officer Rodriguez stepped forward with a small velvet-lined tray. Olivia gently placed the necklace on it, her fingers lingering for a moment before she let go. "We'll need to have this authenticated," Detective Harper explained. "But given the circumstances, I think we can safely say it's not stolen property." As Officer Rodriguez carefully carried the necklace out of the room, there was another knock at the door. Officer Thompson poked his head in. "Detective, the store manager, Mr. Blackwell, is here. He's demanding to know what's going on." Detective Harper sighed. "All right, send him in." Richard Blackwell entered the room, his earlier confidence now replaced with visible unease. His eyes widened as he took in the scene. Olivia, looking small but somehow more dignified than before, and Edwin standing protectively beside her. "Mr. Blackwell," Detective Harper began, "I believe we owe Mrs. Holloway an apology. It appears there's been a significant misunderstanding." Richard's face flushed. I don't understand. Who is this woman, really?" Edwin stepped forward, his voice firm. "This is my aunt, Olivia Holloway, wife of the late Charles Holloway. The necklace you accused her of stealing was a gift from her husband, my uncle, over 50 years ago." Richard's jaw dropped. But that's impossible. Olivia Holloway died years ago. Everyone knows that." "Not died, Mr. Blackwell," Olivia said softly. "Just lost. For a very long time." As Detective Harper briefly explained the situation, Richard's face cycled through a range of emotions: disbelief, shock, and finally, deep remorse. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I can't begin to express how sorry I am. My behavior was inexcusable." Olivia's eyes softened. You were doing your job, dear, protecting what you thought was yours. I understand. Outside the police station, the crowd had grown. Word had spread quickly, and now journalists from various news outlets had joined Sarah Chen, all clamoring for information. The story of the homeless woman with the priceless necklace had captured the city's imagination. Back in the room, Detective Harper was wrapping up his interview. Mrs. Holloway, Mr. Holloway, thank you for your cooperation. We'll need to do some formal verification, but I think we can safely say that the necklace belongs to Mrs. Holloway. Edwin squeezed his aunt's shoulder gently. Detective, what happens now? My aunt has been living on the streets for years. She needs care, a place to stay. Before Detective Harper could respond, Richard Blackwell stepped forward. If I may, he said hesitantly, I'd like to offer Mrs. Holloway a suite at the Hotel Grandeur. It's owned by our parent company. It's the least we can do after this terrible misunderstanding. Olivia looked up at Richard, surprise and gratitude in her eyes. That's very kind of you, Mr. Blackwell. Thank you. As the group prepared to leave the police station, Detective Harper turned to Olivia. Mrs. Holloway, one last thing. Your husband's disappearance. It's still an open case. With your reappearance, we may be able to look into it again. Would you be willing to speak with our cold case department? Olivia's eyes misted over. Yes, she said softly. Yes, I think it's time to find out what happened to my Charles. As they stepped out of the room, they were met with a flurry of activity. Officers paused in their work, watching with curiosity and respect as Olivia walked by, flanked by Edwin and Richard. The story of Olivia Holloway was far from over, but for the first time in decades, she was no longer invisible. She was no longer just a nameless figure on the streets of New York. She was Olivia Holloway, and her story was about to captivate the world. The following days were a whirlwind for Olivia Holloway. After years of anonymity on the streets of New York, she found herself at the center of a media storm. The Hotel Grandeur, where Richard Blackwell had arranged for her to stay, became a hub of activity as journalists clamored for interviews and curious onlookers hoped for a glimpse of the woman everyone was talking about. Olivia sat in her luxurious suite, feeling both overwhelmed and out of place. The soft, plush armchair she occupied was a far cry from the cardboard boxes and park benches she had grown accustomed to. Edwin had brought her some new clothes, simple but elegant outfits that felt strange against her skin after years of wearing threadbare hand-me-downs. Aunt Olivia, Edwin said gently, setting a cup of tea on the table beside her. How are you holding up? Olivia's pale blue eyes met his, a mix of emotions swirling in their depths. It's all so much, Eddie. I never thought I'd be here again in this world. Edwin sat across from her, his face etched with concern and love. I still can't believe you were out there all this time. If only we had known. Olivia reached out and patted his hand. Don't blame yourself, dear. I didn't want to be found. But now. She trailed off, her gaze drifting to the window and the city beyond. A soft knock at the door interrupted their moment. Sarah Chen, the young journalist who had been present at the initial confrontation, poked her head in. Mrs. Holloway? Mr. Holloway? I hope I'm not interrupting. I was wondering if you might be ready for that interview we discussed. Edwin looked to his aunt, ready to decline on her behalf, but Olivia surprised him by nodding. Yes, dear. I think I'm ready to tell my story. As Sarah set up her recording equipment, Olivia took a deep breath, steeling herself for the task ahead. When Sarah gave her a nod, Olivia began to speak, her voice growing stronger with each word. I was born Olivia Louise Thompson in 1934, in a small town outside of Pittsburgh. I met Charles Holloway when I was just 18, working as a salesgirl at Kaufman's department store. He was 25, already making a name for himself as a jeweler. Olivia painted a vivid picture of her life with Charles, their whirlwind romance, their wedding just 6 months after they met, in the early years of their marriage as Charles's reputation in the jewelry world grew. She spoke of glamorous parties, of rubbing elbows with the elite of New York society, and of the joy she found in supporting her husband's passion. Charles was a true artist, Olivia said, her eyes misting over with memories. He saw beauty in every stone, every metal. The pieces he created were more than just jewelry. They were works of art. Sarah leaned forward, captivated by Olivia's tale. And the ruby necklace? Can you tell me about that? Olivia's hand unconsciously moved to her throat, where the necklace would have rested. It was his masterpiece. Charles spent months designing it, selecting each stone with painstaking care. He gave it to me on our 20th wedding anniversary. For my eternal love, he said. Her voice faltered as she continued. That was just 3 days before he disappeared. Sarah's eyes widened. Mrs. Holloway, can you tell us what happened that day? Olivia took a shaky breath, her hands clasping tightly in her lap. It was a Tuesday. Charles had been working late at his studio, as he often did when he was in the midst of a big project. But that night, he never came home. She recounted the frantic phone calls, the police investigations, the endless days and nights of waiting for news that never came. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. No one saw him leave the studio. There was no sign of struggle, no ransom demands, nothing. And after that, Sarah prompted gently. Olivia's eyes clouded over. I couldn't bear it. The pitying looks, the whispers, the constant reminders of Charles everywhere I turned. One day, about a year after Charles disappeared, I just walked away, left everything behind. I thought it would be easier to disappear, to become no one. As Olivia's story unfolded, Sarah found herself blinking back tears. The tale of love, loss, and a life voluntarily abandoned was deeply moving. When Olivia finally fell silent, the room was heavy with emotion. Edwin, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. Aunt Olivia, I had no idea. All these years we thought you had died of grief. Olivia reached out and took his hand. I'm so sorry, Eddie. I never meant to cause such pain. I just couldn't see any other way. As Sarah packed up her equipment, promising to let them review the article before publication, Olivia turned to Edwin. There's something else, Eddie. Something I've never told anyone. Edwin leaned closer, his brow furrowed with concern. What is it, Aunt Olivia? Olivia's voice dropped to a whisper, her eyes darting to the door as if afraid someone might overhear. The night before Charles disappeared, he was acting strange, nervous. He kept saying he had discovered something big, but he wouldn't tell me what it was. He said it was too dangerous. Edwin's eyes widened. Dangerous? What could be dangerous about jewelry? Olivia shook her head, her expression troubled. I don't know, but I've always wondered, was that why he disappeared? Did someone take him because of what he knew? As the sun began to set over New York City, casting long shadows across the luxurious hotel room, Olivia Holloway's story was far from over. The mystery of Charles Holloway's disappearance, dormant for so long, was about to be awakened, promising to uncover secrets that had lain hidden for decades. The following morning, Detective James Harper arrived at the Hotel Grandeur, his weathered face etched with determination. He was accompanied by Detective Lisa Morales, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 30s who specialized in cold cases. They were ushered into Olivia's suite where Edwin was already present, sitting protectively close to his aunt. Mrs. Holloway, Detective Harper began, his voice gentle but professional. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. This is Detective Morales from our cold case unit. We'd like to revisit your husband's disappearance, if you're up for it. Olivia nodded, her pale blue eyes clear and resolute. Yes, of course. It's time we found out what happened to Charles. Detective Morales leaned forward, her notebook at the ready. Mrs. Holloway, can you tell us about the days leading up to your husband's disappearance? Was there anything unusual about his behavior? Olivia's brow furrowed as she cast her mind back to those fateful days. As I mentioned to Eddie yesterday, Charles was acting differently. He seemed nervous, distracted. He kept talking about a discovery he'd made, something important. Did he give you any details about this discovery? Detective Morales pressed. Olivia shook her head. No, he said it was too dangerous to talk about. I assumed it was related to his work, perhaps a new technique or a rare gem. But now, I wonder. Edwin interjected, his voice tight with concern. Aunt Olivia, you never mentioned this before. Why would Uncle Charles's work be dangerous? Olivia turned to her nephew, her eyes clouded with old fears. I don't know, Eddie. It didn't make sense to me then, and it doesn't now, but I remember how scared he looked. Detective Harper's eyebrows knitted together. Mrs. Holloway, do you recall if your husband had any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to harm him or his business? Olivia was quiet for a moment, lost in thought. Charles was well-liked in the industry, but there was one person, a business rival named Victor Kensington. He and Charles had a falling out a few months before the disappearance. Something about a disputed gem acquisition. The detectives exchanged glances. Do you know any more about this dispute? Detective Morales asked. Olivia shook her head. Charles didn't like to burden me with business troubles, but I remember overhearing a heated phone call. Charles accused Victor of something unethical, maybe illegal. As the detectives jotted down notes, a knock at the door interrupted them. Richard Blackwell entered, looking apologetic. I'm sorry to intrude, but there's something you all need to see. He turned on the suite's large television, flipping to a news channel. The room fell silent as they watched a breaking news report. In a shocking turn of events, the anchor announced, the NYPD has reopened the case of Charles Holloway, the famed jeweler who vanished without a trace in 1974. This comes after the recent reappearance of his wife, Olivia Holloway, long presumed dead. The report continued, recapping the events of the past few days and speculating on the mysteries surrounding Charles' disappearance. Olivia watched, her face a mixture of hope and apprehension. As the news segment ended, Detective Harper turned to Olivia. Mrs. Holloway, I'm afraid this case is about to get a lot of attention. Are you prepared for that? Olivia straightened in her chair, a newfound strength in her posture. Detective, I've spent decades hiding from the world. If there's any chance this attention could help us find out what happened to Charles, then I'm ready to face it. Edwin squeezed his aunt's hand supportively. We'll face it together, Aunt Olivia. Richard Blackwell cleared his throat. Mrs. Holloway, I want you to know that you have the full support of our company. We'll do whatever we can to assist in the investigation and to ensure your comfort and privacy. Detective Morales stood, her expression determined. We'll start by looking into this Victor Kensington. Mrs. Holloway, we may need to speak with you again as we uncover more information. Is that all right? Olivia nodded. Of course, I want to know the truth, no matter what it might be. As the detectives prepared to leave, Olivia called out, Wait, there's one more thing. She reached for her purse, withdrawing a small, worn notebook. This was Charles's. I've kept it all these years. I could never bring myself to read it, but maybe it's time. Detective Harper accepted the notebook carefully. Thank you, Mrs. Holloway. This could be invaluable to our investigation. As the door closed behind the detectives, Olivia turned to Edwin and Richard. I have a feeling, she said softly, that we're about to uncover something much bigger than we ever imagined. The three of them looked at each other, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. The mystery of Charles Holloway's disappearance, dormant for so long, was stirring to life. And with it, secrets long buried were threatening to surface, promising to shake the foundations of the glittering world Charles and Olivia had once called home. As the days passed, the investigation into Charles Holloway's disappearance gained momentum. Detective Morales and her team worked tirelessly, poring over old case files and following up on long, cold leads. Olivia found herself thrust into a whirlwind of activity, dividing her time between police interviews and meetings with Edwin to sort through the remnants of her old life. One afternoon, as Olivia sat in her hotel suite, absently fingering the ruby necklace that had started it all, there was a knock at the door. Edwin entered, followed by Sarah Chen, the young journalist who had been covering the story. "Aunt Olivia," Edwin said, his voice tinged with excitement. "Sarah's uncovered something I think you should hear." Olivia straightened in her chair, her pale blue eyes alert. "What is it, dear?" Sarah stepped forward, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. "Mrs. Holloway, I've been doing some digging into Victor Kensington, the business rival you mentioned. It turns out he's still alive, living in upstate New York." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. "After all these years, he might know something about Charles?" Sarah nodded. "That's not all. I managed to track down one of his former employees. She told me something interesting about the time just before Mr. Holloway disappeared." As Sarah relayed her findings, Olivia listened intently, her mind racing. According to the ex-employee, Victor had been obsessed with a particular gemstone acquisition in the months leading up to Charles's disappearance. He had spoken of it as a game changer that would revolutionize the industry. "But here's the strange part," Sarah continued. "The employee overheard a heated phone call between Victor and someone she didn't recognize. They were arguing about the ethics of the acquisition. She distinctly remembers Victor saying, 'You don't understand what's at stake here. This goes beyond just us.'" Edwin leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What could that mean? What kind of gemstone acquisition could be so controversial?" Olivia shook her head slowly, her mind drifting back to those last days with Charles. "I remember Charles being troubled about something. He kept saying he'd discovered something big, something that could change everything. But he never told me what it was." As they pondered this new information, there was another knock at the door. Detective Morales entered, her face grave. "Mrs. Holloway, we've made a discovery I think you need to hear about." She produced a clear evidence bag containing Charles' old notebook. "Our forensics team has been analyzing this. Most of it is standard business notes, but there's a section near the end that's been written in some kind of code." Olivia's eyes widened. "A code? Charles never mentioned anything about that to me." Detective Morales nodded. "We're working on deciphering it, but it's proving challenging. However, we did manage to make out a few words. One phrase keeps recurring: the heart of eternity." The room fell silent as the weight of this revelation settled over them. Edwin was the first to speak. "The heart of eternity? What could that mean?" Sarah's eyes lit up with recognition. "Wait, I've heard that name before. It's an old legend in the gemstone world. Supposedly it's a flawless blue diamond of unprecedented size, but most experts consider it a myth." Olivia's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my! Charles mentioned something about a blue diamond once. He was so excited, but then he never brought it up again. I had almost forgotten about it." Detective Morales leaned forward, her expression intense. "Mrs. Holloway, do you think this heart of eternity could be what your husband discovered? Could it be connected to his disappearance?" Olivia nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It must be. It's the only thing that makes sense. But why would a diamond, even a legendary one, be dangerous?" Edwin stood up, pacing the room. "Maybe it's not just about the diamond itself. What if there's something more to it? Something that someone didn't want revealed?" As they discussed the possibilities, Olivia's mind whirled with memories and half-forgotten conversations. She remembered Charles' excitement, his subsequent nervousness, the hushed phone calls. It all seemed to point to something much bigger than a simple business rivalry or gemstone acquisition. "We need to talk to Victor Kensington," Olivia said firmly, surprising everyone with the strength in her voice. "He might be the key to understanding what really happened to Charles." Detective Morales nodded. "We're already working on arranging an interview with him. But Mrs. Holloway, I must caution you. If this is as big as it seems, there could be risks involved in pursuing this further." Olivia's chin lifted, a spark of determination in her eyes. detective, I've spent decades living in the shadows, running from my past. I'm not running anymore. Whatever the risks, I need to know the truth about what happened to my Charles. As the group looked at each other, a mix of excitement and apprehension hung in the air. They stood on the brink of uncovering a mystery that had lain dormant for half a century. The heart of eternity, whatever it truly was, held the key to Charles Holloway's fate. And Olivia, once lost and forgotten, now found herself at the center of a story that was about to shake the foundations of the jewelry world and beyond. The journey to Victor Kensington's estate in upstate New York was tense with anticipation. Olivia sat in the back of the police car, flanked by Edwin and Detective Morales. The lush countryside rolled by outside the window, a stark contrast to the urban landscape Olivia had called home for so many years. As they approached the sprawling mansion, Olivia's heart raced. This man, once Charles's rival, might hold the key to unlocking the mystery that had defined her life for decades. Detective Morales turned to Olivia, her expression serious. "Mrs. Holloway, remember, you don't have to do this if you're not comfortable. We can handle the questioning." Olivia shook her head, her jaw set with determination. "No, I need to face him myself, for Charles." They were greeted at the door by a stern-faced housekeeper who led them to a grand study. Victor Kensington sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, his once dark hair now a shock of white. As Olivia entered, his eyes widened in disbelief. "Olivia Holloway," he breathed, rising slowly from his chair. "After all these years, we thought you were dead." Olivia stepped forward, her voice steady. "As you can see, Mr. Kensington, reports of my death were greatly exaggerated. But I'm not here to discuss my past. I'm here about Charles." Victor's face paled slightly. He gestured for them to sit. "Of course, I've been following the news. It's quite extraordinary, your reappearance." Detective Morales took charge, her tone professional. "Mr. Kensington, we're reopening the investigation into Charles Holloway's disappearance. We have reason to believe you might have information that could help us." Victor's eyes darted between them. "I'm not sure what I could tell you that I haven't already told the police years ago. Charles and I had our differences, but I had nothing to do with his disappearance." Olivia leaned forward, her gaze intense. "What about the heart of eternity, Mr. Kensington?" The effect was immediate. Victor's composure cracked, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "Where did you hear that name?" he whispered. "It was in Charles's notebook," Olivia pressed. "What was it, Victor?" "What did Charles discover?" Victor stood abruptly, moving to the window. For a long moment, he stared out at the manicured grounds. When he turned back, his face was etched with a mixture of fear and resignation. "I never thought I'd hear that name again," he said softly. "The heart of eternity. It wasn't just a diamond, Olivia. It was so much more." As Victor began to speak, the room fell into a hushed silence. He told them of a discovery Charles had made, a blue diamond of unprecedented size and purity. But it wasn't just the diamond's beauty that made it special. Charles found something impossible, Victor explained, his voice trembling slightly. The diamond had inclusions, patterns within its structure that didn't make sense. They looked artificial. Edwin leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Artificial? What do you mean?" Victor took a deep breath. Charles believed the diamond wasn't natural. He thought it had been created, perhaps millions of years ago, by some advanced civilization. The patterns, they looked like some kind of code or message. Olivia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. That's why he was so excited, and then so scared. He thought he'd found proof of ancient, advanced life on Earth. Victor nodded grimly. Exactly. And that's when things got dangerous. Word got out about Charles's theory. Some people wanted to suppress the discovery, afraid of what it might mean for established history. Others wanted to exploit it. Charles, he just wanted the truth to be known. Detective Morales's pen flew across her notepad. Mr. Kensington, do you know what happened to Charles? Victor's shoulders sagged. The night he disappeared, Charles called me. He was frantic, said he was being followed. He told me he'd hidden the heart of eternity in his research. He made me promise to keep quiet, to protect Olivia. Then the line went dead. Tears welled in Olivia's eyes. All these years, you knew something, and you never said anything? Victor met her gaze, his eyes pleading. I was afraid, Olivia. The people involved. They were powerful, dangerous. I thought by staying quiet, I was protecting you and honoring Charles' last wish. As the weight of Victor's revelation settled over the room, Olivia felt a mix of emotions churning within her. Anger at the years of secrecy, grief for the loss of Charles, and a burning desire to uncover the full truth. Where is it now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The heart of eternity? Victor shook his head. I don't know. Charles never told me where he hid it. But he hesitated, then moved to a painting on the wall. Behind it was a safe. With trembling hands, he opened it and withdrew a small, worn envelope. He left this with me, to be opened only if the truth ever came to light. As Victor handed the envelope to Olivia, the room held its breath. Whatever was inside might finally unlock the mystery of Charles Holloway's disappearance and the secret of the heart of eternity. Olivia stared at her name written in Charles's familiar handwriting, poised on the brink of a truth that had eluded her for half a century. With trembling hands, Olivia opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age but still crisp. Charles's elegant handwriting flowed across the page, a message from the past that brought tears to Olivia's eyes. My dearest Olivia, she read aloud, her voice quavering. If you're reading this, then the truth has finally come to light. I'm so sorry for the pain and uncertainty I must have caused you. Know that everything I did was to protect you and the incredible discovery I made. The room was silent as Olivia continued reading. Charles's letter spoke of his discovery of the heart of eternity and the earth-shattering implications it held. He explained how he had stumbled upon the diamond during a routine sourcing trip and quickly realized its extraordinary nature. The patterns within the diamond, Olivia, Charles wrote, they're not random. They're a message, a code left by beings far more advanced than us, perhaps millions of years ago. I believe they were trying to tell us something, to prepare us for something. Edwin leaned forward, his face a mask of astonishment. Prepare us? For what? Olivia shook her head, continuing to read. I don't know what the message says in its entirety, but I've deciphered enough to know it's of utmost importance. There are others who want to suppress this knowledge, to keep humanity in the dark. I can't let that happen. The letter went on to detail Charles's plan to hide the heart of eternity in his research. He had created an elaborate puzzle, a series of clues that would lead to the diamond's location. I couldn't risk writing down the location, Charles explained in the letter. But I knew you, my brilliant Olivia, would be able to solve the puzzle if the time ever came. The first clue is where it all began, where two hearts became one. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. Our wedding, she whispered. He's talking about the church where we got married. Detective Morales leaned forward, her pen poised over her notepad. Mrs. Holloway, do you remember where that was? Olivia nodded slowly, memories flooding back. St. Patrick's Cathedral. We were married there on a beautiful spring day. Victor, who had been listening intently, spoke up. Olivia, if Charles left clues, they could be dangerous. The people who were after him, they might still be out there. Detective Morales nodded grimly. He's right. We need to approach this carefully. Mrs. Holloway, would you be willing to work with us to follow these clues? We can provide protection and resources. Olivia straightened in her chair, a newfound determination in her eyes. Of course, I've waited 50 years for answers. I'm not stopping now. As they began to discuss their next steps, Sarah Chen, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. Mrs. Holloway, if you're comfortable with it, I'd like to continue documenting this story. The world deserves to know the truth about Charles Holloway in the heart of eternity." Olivia considered for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I think Charles would have wanted that, but we must be careful. The truth could be disruptive." Edwin placed a supportive hand on his aunt's shoulder. "Whatever happens, Aunt Olivia, we're in this together." As the group prepared to leave Victor's estate, each lost in thought about the revelations of the day, Olivia felt a strange mix of emotions. There was sadness for the years lost, excitement for the adventure ahead, and a deep, abiding love for Charles that had never dimmed. Outside, as they walked to the car, Olivia paused, looking up at the clear blue sky. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something, a pattern in the clouds that seemed almost deliberate. She blinked, and it was gone. "Are you all right, Aunt Olivia?" Edwin asked, concern in his voice. Olivia smiled, a mysterious glint in her eye. "Yes, dear. I just have a feeling our journey is about to take us places we never imagined." As they drove away from Victor's estate, the sun setting behind them, Olivia clutched Charles's letter close to her heart. The first step towards unraveling a half-century-old mystery lay ahead at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Whatever they would find there, Olivia knew one thing for certain. Her life, and perhaps the world, would never be the same again. The heart of eternity, with its ancient message and the promise of revolutionary knowledge, waited to be discovered. And Olivia Holloway, once lost and forgotten, now stood at the center of a story that could change the course of human history. The grand interior of St. Patrick's Cathedral echoed with hushed whispers as Olivia, Edwin, Detective Morales, and Sarah Chen carefully examined every nook and cranny. Their search had led them on a whirlwind journey across New York, following Charles's intricate trail of clues. Each discovery had brought them closer to the truth, and now they stood on the precipice of the final revelation. "Look!" Edwin exclaimed, pointing to a small, inconspicuous carving near the altar. It matched the symbol Charles had described in his final clue. With trembling hands, Olivia pressed the carving. A soft click echoed through the cathedral, and a hidden compartment slid open. Inside lay a velvet pouch and a final letter from Charles. As Olivia read the letter aloud, tears streaming down her face, the truth unfolded. Charles explained that he had entrusted the heart of eternity to a secret society of scientists and philosophers, dedicated to unlocking its mysteries and preparing humanity for the knowledge it contained. "The diamond is safe," Charles wrote, "protected by those who understand its importance. When the world is ready, its message will be revealed." Detective Morales carefully opened the velvet pouch, revealing not the heart of eternity itself, but a small, intricately carved replica. Embedded within were microchips containing all of Charles's research and findings. "He wanted us to have the knowledge," Olivia whispered, "but he knew the diamond itself was too dangerous to be found." As they stood in awe of Charles's foresight and sacrifice, a commotion at the cathedral entrance caught their attention. A group of men in dark suits burst in, led by a familiar face, Richard Blackwell. "I'm sorry, Olivia," Richard said, his expression a mix of regret and determination. "We can't let this information get out. The world isn't ready." But before the men could reach them, the cathedral was suddenly filled with a brilliant blue light. The replica in Detective Morales' hand began to pulse, projecting a holographic message that filled the air around them. Strange symbols and diagrams danced before their eyes, slowly resolving into recognizable patterns. It was a message of peace and unity, a call for humanity to look beyond its differences and reach for the stars. As the light faded, Richard and his men stood frozen in awe. The truth of the heart of eternity, hidden for so long, had finally been revealed. In the days that followed, the world buzzed with the news of Charles Holloway's discovery. Scientists and scholars pored over the data, confirming the authenticity of the message and its otherworldly origins. Olivia, once again in the public eye, became a symbol of perseverance and hope. She worked tirelessly with international organizations to share the message of the heart of eternity, fulfilling Charles's lifelong dream. One quiet evening, as Olivia sat in her hotel suite overlooking the city, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. Edwin entered carrying a small package. "It just arrived, Aunt Olivia," he said, handing it to her. Inside was a note from the secret society Charles had mentioned, along with a small, flawless blue diamond, a piece of the heart of eternity entrusted to her as its guardian. As Olivia held the diamond, she saw her reflection in its facets, no longer the forgotten woman on the streets, but a beacon of hope for the future. She smiled, knowing that Charles would be proud of the journey they had taken together, even across the boundaries of time. "We did it, Charles," she whispered, her heart full of love and wonder. "We showed the world the truth, just as you always wanted." Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now, how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.